Welcome to the shop. All right, so today I want to talk about servos. And I know maybe it isn't a big deal. Maybe you're a servo savant and you move on. Fine. This is something that there's so many options for servos. Every plane you have, servo's going to fail. So it's just a matter of when that happens. First, finding it before it's a real problem and you've destroyed your plane because a servo failed. So again, please check before, each time you fly, all of them, including flaps, real important. Second is now you have a bad servo. What do? How do you replace that? Do you go with stock? Some of the stock servos are fine. They work great for a long period of time. Some of them, they're not as good. And maybe you want to have a little bit better quality servo in there. So what are those options? And I'm going to talk about in this video the different options, the thing to look for. There's a lot of data on these servos, speeds, voltage, how much can they, how much thrust or torque do these have? It's a big deal. Or, these cheap things for $1.50 you buy from Amazon. Is that a good replacement? As well as just kind of going through the process of me swapping out servos of different types, whether they need to be soldered or it's just a plug and play. Some of them are glued in, some of them are screwed in. So I kind of want to go through that process. So hope you stick around and we'll go from there. All right, let me just talk through a couple things, right? I've got the pile of servos. This servo right here is a flap servo for a Focke-Wulf 190 E-Flight. It started going bad on me, and so needed to get replaced. And I'm going to go through what I had to do to route, the wires and do all that. Pretty simple one because this one wasn't glued in. There's a little bracket that goes over. I'll show here in a second. But the situation was, well, right there, that model number, A430 servo from Spectrum, I have a ton of servos. Can I replace that? Now we start getting into the physical size because this actually fits inside the wing and a cover goes over it. So the size of that is going to be pretty critical, not to mention then the speed and torque and everything else. I got to be honest, on here after I looked for a while, I couldn't find one that fit, in my bucket of servos. So for $10, I ordered a new one. It fit right in. I had to reroute. I'll show you in a minute what that was all about, but not a big deal. It was pretty easy to replace. So next situation is, let's say, a flap servo on an A10. So this model number here, the A334. Well, could be a case where I can't get this model anymore, or I can't find it, it's back ordered. But what I can do, and here's where I do look at some things, this one right here is a metal geared versus plastic gear, a little heavier, but it's a decent quality servo, and I have a couple of them. And if I look, it is really important that things are the same size. As you look at this, you'll notice that this one's a little taller than that. That can be a problem when you're mounting this in there. Might have to cut away some material. Can be maybe a no big deal, can be a big pain in the butt. The other option you get into is, let's say this guy right here. So a lot of stats on here, the voltage, torque, speed, weight, and so on and so forth. Big thing I look for is, on a lot of these servos is the size. Is it going to fit in the physical space of the servo I'm trying to replace? And I have a whole host of different types of servos of different qualities. None of these are big fancy, $50 servos, but they're maybe a couple bucks more. Some of them are maybe $15. Some of them are $30. For me, that's spending a couple bucks on some servos to replace, the lower quality stock servos that maybe I want to, upgrade. These were the $1.50 servos I bought at Amazon. When I was building a lot of flight test planes with Dollar Tree foam board, these worked well. And surprisingly, they held up pretty good. I'm not going to put them on and replace them with any of my servos or on some of the planes I have now, but for some of the flight test stuff, they work great. Anyway, those are some of the things I think about. The size, speed, because like I said, if like on my P-51, one of my aileron servos went out. Well, I swapped it out with a higher quality servo metal gear, but I had to do both of them. The reason why you have to do both is because there's different speeds and torques and so on and so forth. So if you want your servos and want things to be, basically moving in the right direction or similar direction, you are going to have to replace both of those servos with a better quality. Don't just replace one, replace both of them. This right here is a servo reverser. Basically, plugs into the receiver, plugs into your servo, and now that servo is now a reverse servo, which in certain cases is really critical. So anyway, just some examples of the different servos and things I think about when I'm going through this process. So the Viper here is a good example of these servos here. One of them went bad. There's two of them. I was going to swap that out with a better quality servo, but then I'd have to swap out both of them. You can see I've actually swapped out these servos a couple times for various reasons, but one of them was bad. Prying this out because it's glued in. Problem with like this guy here is it will rip out. It's very thin, and it actually would rip out the back side of this and had to be glued back in. Anyway, not a big deal. It just pries. It's going to make things look ugly, but you don't have a choice. If you want to fix it, you have to yank that out. Go through, rerun it. I went with stock. Now, let me caveat this with also, in this particular case, you have a regular servo and a reverse servo. Reverse servos, like in this case where they're both kind of going the same kind of direction, ailerons you don't have to worry about, but with elevators you do have to worry about. As well as, there's some other configurations where you'll have reverse servo, like on the front nose gear and things like that. Anyway, that needs to get replaced with a reverse servo. One of them's regular servo, the other's reverse servo. They didn't have these in stock. So what I ended up doing is using a servo reverser. It's a little device. I'll show a picture of it that goes in between the servo and the receiver. So I did have a stock servo, but it wasn't reversed. So I just put that in, and it worked out fine. Little foam tack underneath, stick it all together, and we're good to go. So, when one of your servos is starting to act up and you kind of tweak it a little bit, and now she sounds crunchy. She's not supposed to sound like that. And having a flat come down and maybe the other one not come down causes some excitement while you're flying. So this guy needs to be replaced. So I'm going to kind of go through that process of just swapping out a servo. Hopefully I can swap it out with something I already have. If not, either ordering or might have to go a different brand altogether. We'll see. These things happen. No big deal. So the first thing I'm going to do is pry open that little terminal block there and find where the flap is plugged in. Then tie a string on it and ending up basically pulling that through and get the end of the string. Just fish that line through. If you don't do this and just rip it through, you're going to have a trouble bringing it back the other way. Not a big deal. Now, next step, we're going to get our new servo ready to go. Tie that in. I like to wrap a little tape around it so it feeds better. You might need to obviously remove that servo so there's enough space for the plug to fit through. But then it's a process of routing it and plugging it back in. Sometimes swapping out a servo is not a big deal. You just unscrew it, pop the one out, pop a new one in, make sure that the new one is going to do what you want from a speed, feeds, torques, and so on, and fitting perspective, but not a big deal. So my E-flite P51 1.2, one of the aileron servos basically died on me. So I had some free wing Metal Gear Digital to swap them out. Here's what I was talking about. You got to swap both of them out. You can't just do one. It fit pretty well. I had to take some pieces apart. But one thing was I didn't want to route all that line and rip off all the tape, maybe get new tape or try to stick it back on. So I did the soldering method. It's pretty easy to do. You got to cut the plugs off, mesh the wires together, hit it with some solder, put on your shrink wrap beforehand, and then put it back together and you're pretty much good to go. Servos work great for a long time, a little bit better quality, and I had them on hand, so that was why I did that. There are times where, you're going to need to supply your own servos. So just real quick, this is my Skywing Edge 540 48 inch. Needed some beefy servos. Now, they'll sell them for $50 a piece, but I didn't want to go down that path. So I grabbed some good, decent comparable AG FRCs that had the right torque, had the right speed, and they were high voltage. So I can run a little bit more volts through that to make them faster and a little bit more power. Anyway, just some options for you that sometimes you got to take a look out there, shop a little bit to find some of those other servos. Bottom line, servos are going to fail. Not a big deal. Make sure you catch it before it's in the air failing, because that gets things pretty exciting. So have a plan at least. Have some servos on hand. Because gosh forbid, the servo that you need is on back order. There are a lot of good quality servos out there that will replace what you have. Just make sure you're matching the right specifications. The other thing is, if you have to swap out an aileron servo with something different, swap out the other one. Do yourself a favor, especially if it's a plane that you really kind of are fond of. It takes very little time. Go ahead and do the extra effort and get 2 servos. Take the one that's good and put that in the pile in case you need one for another one of your planes. Anyway, if you have any questions, leave a comment, like, subscribe, all the cool stuff. Thanks a lot. Have a great day.